Okay, in this lesson what I'm going to look at is ways to retopologize a Dynamesh character. Now, Dynamesh is a great way to get started on the basic sort of shape and the topology of your character, but if we turn on the polyframe mode, and this isn't sort of particularly detailed work, we can't get in there and sort of sculpt too much detail at this resolution, but you can see that we're actually looking at close to 400,000 points, which is roughly 400,000 polygons. And if you brought that into a game engine like UDK, well, you'd basically kill your computer or your GPU. So even though Dynamesh is a great way to get started, we can't use it as our final geometry to bring into a game engine. So how do we convert this this basic sort of shape into something that we can use? And there are mainly three methods, and what I'll do is I will just duplicate this mesh, or duplicate this subtool, and I'm going to hide that as my original. So the first one that we're going to have a look at is probably the easiest, and it's definitely the fastest, and that is if we come down to it's geometry and QRemesher. Now I've gone through QRemesher in a previous tutorial, I think. So if you have sort of seen that tutorial, or you've seen other tutorials on QRemesher, feel free to sort of to skip this. But the basic idea is that QRemesher runs an algorithm, checks where you need geometry in order to and it sort of it fills in that geometry with sort of slightly denser areas, and what it really looks at is the flow of polygons. If it can draw flowing lines and flowing circles around your loops, around your geometry. So this is what it's basically like if you just press the button and don't worry about any of the settings. And you can see that we have reduced our mesh down considerably. We now are closer to 15K polygon. Now remember that will be doubled with a game engine like UDK, because everything gets triangled, so just remember that. So you can see that we have flowing geometry. We have these sorts of loops around areas. In our original Dynamesh, it basically cuts everything up into a grid. It forms a 3D grid and slices up your model, and then sort of fills in the areas where the squares don't sort of line up with triangles. But QRemesher actually takes in the flow of your model, and then takes that flow and constructs loops around your model, and then fills in those loops with a grid like that. And it really is an incredibly powerful tool, and it's really great for those sorts of these sorts of operations, particularly with characters. Now, there appears to be sort of little sort of funky areas here where we don't have quite enough geometry to sort of to get that overall shape, but once we divide a couple of times and project, most of the time these sorts of things come in. Now the problem is that it does all of these things automatically, which means that we do get we do get these sort of loops form that perhaps we wouldn't have chosen if we were going to draw this out. For example, you can see that we might want to sort of have more of a loop coming down from the shoulder blades across to the center of the chest. Unfortunately, the QRemesher, its analysis picked going from the chest down to under the armpits as sort of more effective or more efficient with polygons. Now, if we want to sort of have a little bit more control over the geometry, and I must stress a little bit more control, because the more control that we exert, the less the automatic process works for us. So what I'll do, and I might just duplicate out this copy just for comparison, and if we come back to this guy, hide that, and I'll just undo the remesh. Just see if we've got the undo history on that. There we go. So I'll just hide that. So coming back to this original Dynamesh, what we can use alongside QRemesher is we can actually use the QRemesher tool. So it is nice cube icon under Q. Remember your ABCs. QRS. There it is. It's the one grayed out. So there's your QRemesher guides tool. So what we can use there is if we just draw it out, and it draws out as a curve, the same as sort of any other curve tool. It depends on your draw size here, and we can use this to draw more of that sort of what I like to call the cowl shape. And like other sort of curve brushes, we can hold down Shift and draw off our model in order to sort of create a loop around the topology of the model like that. Now another thing is that we might want to make sure that we get some of this facial geometry to show up as a sort of more of a loop, and so what I'll do is draw a loop like that, and got to worry about snapping distances, and I think it's under brush, and I'll just drag this over to here. Curve modifiers. Okay. There's a curve snap distance modifier somewhere, but for now I'll just cheat, get in a bit closer, and take the size down a little. And go around like that. And I wanted it to come more into the chin there, so like that. And unfortunately we've gone off the mesh there, so I'm just going to like that. And so we have these sorts of shapes that we can do. And let's see, if we go back to this subtool, we can see that the hips are actually in a pretty good shape. You'll notice that we are losing quite a bit of resolution there, and also we want more resolution in the fingers, and we can sort of fix that up as well, but the loops seem okay. But what I'll do is going back to this guy is I think that's fine for my loops, but what I want is more resolution in, say, the face, the tips of these horns that were losing geometry, and the fingers and that tail. So what I'll do is, with a larger draw size, I'm going to mask those areas off. And you don't have to be too sort of too pedantic about it, because we're just going to leave these as suggestions rather than as sort of, you know, definites. That, that, and that. And the face is definitely important to sort of get geometry on. So I'm just going to mask those areas off. And now, with those lines drawn, I'm going to come back down to QRemesher, turn on auto mask. The mask density is going to be 4 times, so that's going to be the target sort of density that it's going to go for. Target polygon count, 15 seemed fine for our actual density. Now the curve stiffness, and if I just hold down Control, you can see that this is how much it sort of constrains to the curves that we have. Now we're using not many curves, so we can crank this up a little bit. I find that if we go with a stiffness of about 90, then it's fairly sort of close, and it still sort of utilizes that that automatic algorithm properly. So now, if we hit the button with these new settings, and we can see that we have a slightly different mesh that we've come through. Now, the first thing that you would probably notice is our geometry here is now swooping up and around the shoulders. It's got that cowl curve that I was talking about before. The masking that we put on the horns has had some effect, but not a great deal, but that's because we are only sort of having the 15K polygons. But it's still working to a certain extent, and when we divide down it will sort of match up a little bit better. You'll notice that we have a loop around the eye area here and a loop around this sort of muzzle here. Now, one thing that we've noticed is that because we have introduced these curves and given it a stiffness of 90, saying that yes, these curves are important, it has introduced sort of, you know, problems with our the automatic algorithm that it uses to create the geometry. Now, if we actually just smooth that out, we can sort of come up with slightly sort of less collapsed geometry. But you can see that we are getting sort of, you know, quite a bit of sort of additional geometry there that we definitely don't need. And if we come down, we can see that we have got much more geometry on the fingers than we had before. And if we look at this, you can see that we have barely enough to sort of even have a suggestion of those claws, whereas now we have sort of most of those claws coming through. And again, because of our fiddling around, we have sort of created slightly sort of, slight variations on these legs, which might not be particularly sort of, beneficial. Now, what I will do is, instead of using the smooth tool, just see if it's no. Okay. What we can do is we can use a deformer. So what I'll do is actually just mask out the areas that I'm not quite happy with, the areas that we've sort of introduced a little bit of weirdness from our messing around. And don't let it smooth out too much. And we'll just bend that down. And I'll invert that. And if we come down to our deformers in the deformations tab, what we can do is use this relax slider. I'm just going to in here and particularly have a look at this tail. You can see this very sort of funky geometry here. If we turn up our relax slider, you can see that we get that those polys to sort of go back into a more sort of it's almost like smoothing, but what it actually does is it redistributes the polygons without causing the shape underneath to collapse, but obviously in redistributing those polys, the actual sum of the geometry does disappear. So that's basically QRemeshing. And what we can do now that we have this sort of QRemeshed shape, is if we divide a few times and we have a million polys there, that's probably just see. No, I will divide that. Okay. So just as long as we have enough to get our original geometry back in, and there's our original, and what I'll do is I'll bring it down a level, come down to project, or up to project. I'm just going to project all, go up one, project all, go up to 3, project all, and go up to 4, and project all. And now if we come and have a look at this, turn that off, you can see that we are pretty much back to the overall shape that we had with our Dynamesh character. We're getting some sort of funkiness there. And what we can do to try and fix that up is if we come down to project and take this distance up to something like 2 and project all. And you can see that we have projected those details quite a bit sort of closer to the original. And let's just check these fingers. Yep, those claws seem to be alright. Now, because we've used QRemesher, you can see that the loops of our fingers are traveling all the way down to the tips of the claws, and that's something that I would prefer we didn't have. I'd prefer it if we had sort of loops going around the base of the claws here, and that's something that we could either sort of try to figure out with the QRemesher brush here, or it's something that we could maybe get to in one of our other sort of methods. And now that we have that all projected, if we come back down to our actual export mesh, this is what would probably be going to Maya to then sort of go into UDK. You can see that we have a much closer overall shape to it. Now, I think a lot of these actual loops can be taken out, and I find the easiest way to do that is to actually take it into Maya and delete loops that way, and I might do that in another lesson. And it's basically just a question of selecting the loops and deleting them. Now, QRemesher often, instead of just producing loops, can produce spirals around limbs, and if that happens, there is a trick in order to be able to delete like every second loop, because if it's a spiral, that's all one row anyway. But what you can do is you actually join up the spiral loops from one to the other, and then you basically uncorkscrew everything. And then you can sort of delete those loops, bring it back into ZBrush, and then sort of use your relax in order to reproject everything. So that's basically the QRemesher method of taking your original Dynamesh character and taking it down to a much more manageable polygon count so that you can bring it into UDK. And I think in the next lesson we'll go on with the other methods and perhaps the more effective methods for sort of fiddly objects and sort of high detail work, the other methods that we have available in ZBrush.